So, Renato, does anything even matter anymore?
It's complicated. I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet.
Boy.
Yeah.
So I picked quite a week to go on vacation.
Yeah, you come back and suddenly everything changed. It's like that meme with the guy who walks in with the pizza and everything is on fire. He's like, what happened?
Right. Or like Back to the Future, where I come back and it's like a different reality.
Yeah, like Biff controls everything.
Yes.
Like, how'd that happen? But we're only being slightly tongue in cheek here because a lot of the things that we focus on this podcast, all these court cases, the Supreme Court, and all of this is sort of off to the side right now. Everyone is focused on this sprint to the election.
Yes.
So I think one thing you were discussing is it does make sense to perhaps kind of talk about the status of everything as we're going through this final stretch into the election.
Yeah, I mean, I think, because there was also a major development on one of those cases that I think is worth talking about. But yeah, where are these cases? So this came up in my Substack office hours yesterday. People are feeling overwhelmed. All of this political news is adding to people's sense of overwhelm in terms of just keeping track. And yeah, I think it's worth maybe checking in on not just the criminal cases, but the civil, judgments, and just a snapshot of where everything is. And what we see as next steps that could plausibly happen in the next 4 months.
Well, I think the obvious place to start is the one case where very substantial things have happened and are happening before the election, the Manhattan DA's case. We had a criminal trial. There was a sentencing set. And after the Supreme Court's ruling regarding presidential immunity, the judge agreed to delay the sentencing so that Trump's team could file motions, arguing essentially that the conviction, I'm sure they're going to argue it should be set aside. But, in the alternative, and I think a more meritorious motion would be that a new trial is required because evidence was introduced regarding official acts by Trump during the course of his presidency, such as tweets, which the Supreme Court claims could be official acts, but also his words and actions with Hope Hicks, or the testimony of Hope Hicks regarding the words and actions of Trump during his presidency.
Yes, and the judge has delayed sentencing.
Right, so he's delayed it through September 18th, which gives the parties, I think they wrote him a letter and basically said, here's which practitioners do all the time, like in cases if the Supreme Court or a Circuit Court of Appeals comes up with a decision that I think might impact things, I'll send a letter to the judge like, hey, we already filed everything, or we're in late stage of the case, but this case impacts things. Often lawyers do that when it's not really that squarely on point because you're looking for anything to move the needle. But here it's obviously very important. So the judge delayed the sentencing until September 18th, which is very close to the election, obviously. And, that will all play out. And what I expect to happen there is that I just think the judge is going to deny the motions. But I do think that there is a real possibility that an appellate court's going to view that matter differently. It might require a new trial. I don't think that's going to please Donald Trump because at that point the election's over one way or the other. And who knows if he's president, whether another trial will happen. But I think that's likely what's going to happen this hearing.
Yes, and the standard that the judge is going to use for that it's called a harmless error standard, right? It's probably looking at the facts, assuming they're true, would this have impacted the jury's verdict? I don't really know how you gain that out, and that when there's so much evidence, but it seems like that's a pretty high bar to meet.
That's right. I mean, it is, and it's essentially meant to reduce the number of redos, do-overs of criminal trials, because they're very time consuming. And so it's essentially something that courts came up with, because criminal defendants, if they're convicted, are always going to have a direct appeal. And then they're always going to raise issues in a later subsequent petition, or not always, but generally are going to do that. So there's a lot of issues raised, and human beings are not perfect. So there are often errors of one kind or another during a trial by the judge. And if every little error meant that you had to start over and do a new trial, we would never get anything done in the criminal justice system. And so courts are like, look, you got caught with the money and the drugs. We're not redoing this because they let in some testimony they weren't supposed to. Like, you're screwed anyway. The reason we're proceeding to harmless error is because I think, just to be clear, is that you only look at that analysis if there is a problem. And I think this is your implicit in your comment, Asha, is that there is an issue with letting in OPIC's testimony post Supreme Court ruling. And I think it is a judgment call by the judge regarding whether it was harmless error or not. And the reason why is because on the one side, as you point out, there's a lot of evidence here. On the other hand, it was a piece of evidence that the prosecution highlighted in their closing argument.
Yeah. And it kind of really went to his intent. I mean, they were really relying on her to say what he really cared about here was burying the story, in order to, even after the election, he wanted it to be not known.
Yeah, it was impactful, and she, given her bias in favor of Trump, the fact that she actually
had a lot of
Trump,
credibility. Yeah,
she had a lot of credibility, and so I think it did have an impact on the jury. But that's really something for the court to decide. Like I said, my prediction is the Judge Merchan, upholds that conviction.
Okay, so basically nothing. That's just going to be proceeding through the court system. That issue, the immunity issue, and whether it impacts the convictions, will continue through the election. Unlikely to be resolved, and we're unlikely to see sentencing before that.
Oh no, I think the sentencing will go forward.
You think the sentencing will go forward while it's on appeal?
I think it'll go forward before the appeal, then there'll be an appeal after. Oh yeah, I think he'll get sentenced before the election.
Really?
Merchan's going to make sure that happens. No, I do think that's going to happen. I think Judge Merchan is going to listen very carefully to these. I think he's going to deny the motions. I think he's going to have his sentencing in September 18th or whatever. And then Judge is going to get, he's going to give a light sentence to Trump. And Trump's going to be very upset about it. And then he's going to appeal. And maybe at some point in time, an appellate court in New York is like, yeah, this is problematic. We need a do-over. And by then it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That's my prediction.
Yeah. And any prediction on the light sentence? Cleaning trash in subways?
I think it's just going to be some sort of something very
one
minor.
Day of
probation,
mar-a-lago house arrest?
Not even. I think probation. I don't think he's going to put him on house arrest in the middle of the election. Yeah. I think it's going to be something minor.
Okay.
And then it'll be hard because the judge is going to give him a light sentence given all of this. But Trump's going to go ballistic on Ron Merchan anyway.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to Fulton County.
Okay. What?
I
Is
know.
that actually still a thing?
I know. That's been... You know what's so crazy is like how much momentum that had? And then it was record scratch when all of this nonsense came to light. But it looks like the case there is at the appellate court. There's an oral argument scheduled for October 4th to determine whether DA Fonnie Willis can continue to prosecute the case.
Yeah, I mean, look, that is not going anywhere fast. So, could that still be a thing? Potentially. I think that might be like if you're waiting for a Fulton County trial to happen, you might be like waiting until like 2026 or something. I mean, that is just, I don't know what's going to happen there. This whole issue's got to get resolved. The case has stayed. Potentially a new prosecutor's going to end up taking this over.
A new prosecutor is not going to end up taking this over because it would have to go to a completely different office at this point.
Yeah.
And I just don't see any office like in Georgia wanting to touch this case with a 10-foot pole.
Yeah, and I think it's Kemp Kemp has some sort of control over which DA goes to or what office it goes to. So yeah, that's probably right. It just dies.
Yeah.
Well,
so and just so people understand what the appeal is from, this is an appeal from the Superior Court judge, Scott McAfee, who found in March that there was no conflict of interest in Willis prosecuting the case because there was a affair that she had with the special prosecutor who was also prosecuting the case, whom she appointed. But he allowed Trump to appeal that ruling. And that's kind of that's what this is right now. So this, if you just think about that, like from March to the oral argument being heard in October, that's slow. And then they would have to decide after that. And then I have a question for you, though, Renato. What does this mean for the people who've already pleaded guilty? So, let's assume that the appellate court says, no, she has a conflict of interest, like she can't prosecute. Is it really only about her continuing to prosecute? Or does that give a basis for people like Jenna Ellis and Sidney Howell to come back and say, like, I want takebacks?
Yeah, it's a difference. This is the difference between like academic. I'll give you a real answer versus like an academic answer.
Okay.
Like academic answer is, yeah, could we, if we were doing a law school exam, could we like come up with some fact pattern under which like, and I could walk through a bunch of steps of what somebody could do? Perhaps. But as a practical matter, all these people pleaded guilty to and got like nothing, right? They got like no sentence essentially, and all they had to do for it was like sit down and do like one recorded interview in which they didn't say much.
Yeah.
I think if any of those people wanted to hire me at $1 bazillion an hour or whatever to like go and undo all of this, I'd be like, are you crazy? Like, do we really want that to happen? Like, it just seems like a colossal waste of time. I'm not sure it's meritorious. Why don't you just take your money and burn it?
Yeah.
It just won't happen as a practical matter.
Well, I don't know. If it resulted in me not having a felony conviction on my record, I might think it's worth it.
It's interesting. It's possible. The reality is what's going to happen is there's a motion that will have to be able to try to undo their guilty plea. But then the question would be, why? And then they would have to, I think, say, because they told the judge under oath that they're pleading guilty because they're actually guilty and they actually did it. And so,
yeah, but if her actual administration of the case is determined to be conflicted, like my argument would be on behalf of my clients, like she should never have brought this case anyway. There was nothing to plead guilty to because this I'm just arguing as a devil's advocate.
No, I know
you
are, but the problem there. So that's usually not how these convictions get overturned because or guilty pleas get withdrawn. Because the problem with making the argument like, hey, they should have never brought the case is, well, you moved your lips under oath and said, I am actually guilty. I actually did this. So to then complain that they shouldn't have brought the case is kind of problematic for a criminal defendant. I think usually what it is my lawyer didn't inform me that there was this really important defense I had or motion I had or whatever, and now it has come to light and I want to undo this because I wasn't properly informed by my lawyer. And so usually it's throwing that lawyer under the bus, or the lawyer says this evidence was hidden by the prosecutors or something that like would have gone to the fundamental rights of the person. And I think it'll be hard to explain to the judge that like, yeah, the reason, if we only knew that like Fonnie Willis was getting it on with the prosecutor, we would have not pleaded guilty. Maybe. I mean, it's like I said, it's the sort of thing. Is it it's an academic question. I can't imagine. I mean, I get why you're right. There may be. If somebody's got a lot of money to burn, they might want to try to do that. Yeah, maybe. But I think it's unlikely to succeed. But that's something that I will say. I'm not a Georgia lawyer, so there may be, something under Georgia law that might make that more likely. But as a general rule, that's
too bad, so sad.
Yeah, it's tough.
First mover disadvantage.
Yeah, it's tough. Well, it's partly because of how we set up guilty pleas. So, like, when you plead guilty, you have, like, the court asks you a bazillion questions. It's remarkable if you sit through one of these, like, how anyone actually does plead guilty. I have to prepare people to answer, 60 different questions. Like, are you sure you did it? Did anyone try to threaten you to do it? Are you convinced that you did it? Have you read everything? Have you talked it over with your attorney? Do you know you have the right to this? You have the right to that? You're waiving all of these rights by pleading guilty. Like, it's just so much. And so at the end of that, it's like really hard for people to come forward and be like, actually, I'm not guilty. I was totally tricked. I said this because I was, so it has to be something that really changes the ball in some significant way. Like, I wasn't told that I'm going to be deported. And this totally changes the calculus for me. I was not informed of that. And that's a very significant consequence of this conviction that I was not informed of. Something along those lines.
All right. Okay. So next case, January 6th case, which has now been, well, I don't know if the mandate has come down because it hasn't been. How long ago was that decision?
Yeah. Not long.
But
not
okay,
long
so it's going to be
our life.
It has to formally be sent back to Chutkan. I don't know if there's a window in which the Supreme Court
does that.
But once that mandate is issued, it'll go back down to her court, right?
Yeah, and then she can ask for briefing, presumably, regarding the issues that have been raised in light of that decision. I mean, I think what she's going to do is say, I want briefing, right, in light of the Supreme Court decision regarding the parties, regarding the party's position, particularly the government first. What do you think is going to go forward here, if anything, from this indictment?
Do you think Jack Smith is going to try to, amend the indictment before? Is that an option for him to strip it down? I mean, we know, for example, from the immunity opinion that the court has taken the Jeffrey Clark stuff off the table.
Right. And that's why I said, I think she has to direct it at the government first and essentially say to the government, what, if anything, are you proceeding on? And then she's got to determine under the Supreme Court decisions whether that's sufficient for it to still be a charge. I mean, the Supreme Court made very clear that Jack Smith couldn't just decide, we're going forward on paragraphs 1, 14, 18, and 33, and then just, that's it. We're going forward. She's got to determine, like, if for a conspiracy count, if we take out these 8 paragraphs, do we still have enough to have a proper charge? So that is going to occur first. I'm sure that, and so the government's going to say, here's what we're going forward on. Trump's team's going to respond to that. She's going to make a decision on that point. Then I think she's going to have to make evidentiary rulings regarding various pieces of evidence. So I think there'll be hearings on that. But, when will that occur? I mean, I do think some of that will occur before the election. Some of it will occur after. But that's as far as we're going to get in that case before the election at this point.
Right. And anything that she decides will be appealed anyway. I mean, this is kind of the crazy part of the immunity ruling, right? Like, they've kind of given not that much guidance, and they've left it so that anything winds up back in their lap to make the call.
I think the question's when, but when it happens. But I think what they did is they sent it back down to Chutkan, and they had her do enough things so that it was going to take time, and it'll happen after the election. I think that part is for sure.
And do you think that evidentiary hearing I mean, I've heard our colleague Norm Eisen say that would
I
basically
don't
be like
know.
a mini trial. Um, is that in and of itself like going to kind of reveal information to people in advance? And okay, second question, because this also came up in my Substack, and I'll tell you what I said. The question was whether she might delay some of this because of the election. And I said, no, I don't think she's bound by these policy considerations that bind the Department of Justice with regard to certain investigative steps or bringing charges in advance of an election. I think, like, you know, this ship has sailed. Like, everybody knows he's been formally charged. So what difference does it make?
So I think it's not clear to me whether there's going to be like a full-blown evidentiary hearing. I don't think that's the first thing that's going to happen for sure. Like, in other words, the first thing that's going to happen is, what's the indictment?
They have to know what they're moving
forward on.
What's
the indictment? That's going to take time. The Smith's team, I'm sure, has already figured that out, but they're going to have to, and they're probably already worked on something, or they've started up, they're started drafting something, but they're going to have to unveil that. Trump's team's going to have to respond. She's going to have to issue a ruling. Let's say that burns a month and a half. Okay, I don't know, something along those lines for all of that to happen. Briefing, motion, response, reply, her ruling. Okay, then she's going to have to then she's going to get motions from the defense about various pieces of evidence. And so at that point, I mean, we're almost in August already. So maybe that's going to be, those motions get filed in September. It really depends. I mean, Jack Smith could just say we're not, could for certain of the motions say we're not offering that. We don't need that evidence or something along those lines. And then for others, like, does she really need live testimony for some of these things? It might, but it might not. I mean, for a lot of it, I mean, typically a judge is going to decide as much of that on the paper as possible. In other words, on the filings, not on a live witness testimony. So is it possible? Yeah. Is it going to be like a full-blown mini trial? I doubt it. I do agree with you, but for slightly different reasons. Well, not in different reasons. I agree with you, but I guess what I would just say regarding the scheduling and what Chutkin will do. But I think a lot of that is because of her. In other words, judges, as we've discussed in other contexts, Asha, regarding Judge Cannon, judges have like extraordinary discretion. And in terms of their docket and their calendar, and Judge Chutkin's made clear from the beginning, she doesn't really care. She's just like the honey badger. She's just going to move forward and whatever. So she's just doing her thing. This is a case, and she's moving forward on it, and she's not taking any of that into account. Other judges might, but she's not. And so she's just going to do what she's going to do and move this case forward.
So finally, we get to
Mar-a-Lago.
The loose cannon strikes again.
Well, yeah. I mean, nothing is going to happen there for some time, right? I mean, that case that's been appealed by Jack Smith, and even if that case goes forward, it's going to take a long time.
Yeah, and I don't suppose that there's any way for Jack Smith or for the Southern District of Florida to take it over.
They can't take it over. They have to start over. So
they would have to get a new grand jury.
I would think that they would have to. I don't know. It would be interesting. I don't know if they could just step in. So, we're handling this. We're taking it on. I mean, these charges were brought by the special counsel's office. That's a great question. I think the way I would think about it is, okay, you could have a new indictment from the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of Florida. It would get assigned to Cannon as a related case. Then you start from scratch. Like, I don't think there's some obvious way. It's not like you could have the U.S. Attorney or
But it still come from the Department of Justice. I mean, ultimately, it was approved by the Attorney General, even if the prosecutor was
Wasn't
Jack
that the
Smith.
question? They're arguing that's the whole issue. Is the legal issue was Jack Smith operating under the supervision of the Attorney General, or is he like his own officer out there? If for purposes of the United States Constitution, that's really the legal issue. There's going to be some disagreement about that. a very clean way of dealing with this would be to have the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida indict and then move forward on the, same indictment. But there are issues with that too, because is there a double jeopardy issue there? I don't know. That's really complicated. That's really complicated. I haven't thought about it enough, but it's not obvious to me.
So what if, do you think there's a chance that the 11th Circuit will overrule Cannon and reassign the case?
Oh, I overrule Cannon? Yeah, I think that's very likely the 11th Circuit's going to overrule Cannon. Then it's going to go to the Supreme Court. I don't think it's going to get 5 votes. I don't think Cannon's going to get 5 votes in the Supreme Court. She's got 1 vote. I don't think she's going to get 5. But I could be wrong. But
is this the kind of ruling where they can be like, girl, you crazy. Mm-hmm. We're giving this case to somebody else.
Oh, give the case, you mean give the judge? No, I don't think that happens. It's very, very rare that happens. That almost never happens. Stop trying to make it happen. It's not going to happen.
I know, but it's very, very rare that a judge is this cuckoo pants.
I understand, but it's in this case, by the way, Thomas, I think, knew exactly what he's doing. He did her a favor, because how is it that if you're taking the position of the Supreme Court justice, how is this like some sort of crazy thing? This is not like the craziest stuff she did was in that civil case that was filed, where she's interfering in an ongoing grand jury investigation because a guy whose home was searched filed like a civil lawsuit. That's crazy. I'll just tell you, if that was the case, we'd be filing them left and right. Anytime a rich person was under investigation, let's file a bunch of civil lawsuits tying up the Justice Department. So I think that was crazy. This is sort of whatever. This is something that was within the realm of like something a Federal Society type judge would decide.
I also think, this is, especially if this is not something that the Southern District can step into, I think one of the things that's so nefarious about this is that she understands that a special counsel survives the election, regardless of who wins. We saw that with John Durham, right? It was appointed by Barr, Biden wins. So I just feel like this was kind of looking ahead. Let's just cut this off at the knees. It's not just the case, but also the ability of that case to survive into a potential Trump administration.
I hear you, but I think that Trump would just order the Attorney General to fire the special counsel.
Okay, fair enough.
I don't think he has any. He doesn't give a crap either. So I just think he's going to do whatever he wants to.
Okay, well, there we are.
There we are.
Okay, Renato, so we've gone through all of the procedural postures of these cases, and one of my Substack subscribers noted that you had always been sad panda about these cases, not believing that they were going to get very far before the election, though I think the New York case even surprised you that it moved forward and got the conviction. Okay, so let's leave that aside, or maybe we can include it. Do you feel vindicated, or are you still surprised that although you were right, the way that things unfolded?
Yeah, I think to an extent, I suppose. I certainly think there's a lot of unreliable legal analysis out there. I whether you call it optimistic or wish casting or whatever, I think that was the case during the Mueller investigation. It's been during the case during all of this stuff too. But I think for me, it's a lot has surprised me here. The strength of the Manhattan DA case surprised me, and candidly, the poor performance of Trump's legal team surprised me a little bit. And I wrote about that. But putting that to the side, that was like a surprise in one direction. I will say that I was definitely surprised by. With Chutkan's case, with the January 6th case, at the breadth of what the Supreme Court did. I am not surprised that the Supreme Court ultimately decided some issue on immunity, but I thought it was going to be very narrow. It might burn a bunch of the clock, but it wasn't going to really move the needle. I kind of expected it to look more like Justice Barrett's separate opinion than what we actually got for the majority. So that was a total surprise to me.
Yeah.
And then I think for Mar-a-Lago, I don't think anything about Cannon surprised me, but once Justice Thomas wrote that opinion, it surprised me. It didn't surprise me, but I will say, I thought she was just going to delay this forever. And I don't know if you had the same reaction.
Yeah, I did too. I did not have declare special counsel illegal on my bingo card.
And I didn't have Fani Willis like self-imploding.
Oh my God, no.
Bingo card either.
No.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, it's interesting how much that flamed out.
Yeah.
I'm not. I mean, for me, where I was coming from, with most of this is just as somebody litigates stuff around the country, courts are slow, things take a long time to happen, criminal cases, don't occur in the sort of lightning speed that you'd expect. It's like it was a safe bet to say like nothing was going to happen anytime soon, and a lot of these cases were kind of unprecedented and involved all sorts of complicated issues. But I will say, what happened with Judge Cannon was definitely outside the norm.
Yeah.
I think, I will say too, one thing that's interesting to me, Asha, that I wouldn't have expected is how quickly the focus has changed, in part because of all of these events, right? I mean, over the last few weeks, we had, Biden's performance debate, Trump assassination attempt, a whole, reckoning within the Democratic Party. Biden decides not to run. Harris is now the nominee. And what we have is, prosecutor versus felon is being thrown out as some sort of campaign slogan. And it really almost, I think, it doesn't matter for campaign purposes, any of this at this point. It's just a kind of race to the finish line. And the felon thing has already happened from the perspective of a campaign.
Yeah,
now.
I think that's right. I think that's the fact that Harris is in the race changes the frame. Because one of the things that Trump has been able to do in both 2016 and then, he was planning to do for 2024 was to create an equivalency between himself, or at least in 2016, it was Hillary was a criminal, lock her up, she's engaged in all these illegal behaviors. Then there was the Biden crime family, Burisma, with Hunter Biden actually getting convicted, and that was provided a lot of fodder. And you can see that I agree with you. Like, does it really matter at this point whether, Trump's appeal in New York? I mean, he is a convicted felon. And right now he doesn't have anything on her. And so this dichotomy is now the frame. And he's actually accepted the frame. He's really struggling with it. I don't know if you saw, he's even saying, they're calling her the prosecutor and me the felon. That's their campaign. And it's like, okay, fact check. She is prosecutor and you are a felon.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I mean, the funny thing is, technically speaking, I think until the judgment is like your sentence.
I know he's not.
The judge is sure you're not a felon, but yeah, for all practical purposes, you are. That's certainly the way any ordinary person would look at this. You got a jury found you guilty of a bunch of felonies, right? So wasn't like one or two either. So it's a lot of felony counts. Yeah, I think you're right on that. And ultimately, if he wins, none of this matters because he's just going to order all of it to go away. And if he loses, by the time like all of this works its way through the system, who knows, right? At that point, he's going to be irrelevant. At that point, well, I don't know, irrelevant, but he's not going to. I don't know if maybe he'll run for president again. I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't be predicting anything. I don't know anything about politics, but yeah, it's definitely the stakes are lower, right?
Yeah. Well, we'll see.
Indeed. So, Asha, both of us are a little tired. I've been working a lot, but for you, I feel like you have been through the ringer in the last couple days. There's a good reason for you to be exhausted.
Yeah, I was caught up in this whole whatever computer outage shenanigans that happened with Crowdstrike that affected the airlines. I was in Costa Rica last week. That's why I missed the news dump that happened all week on all these different fronts. And I was in Costa Rica. It was a great trip. Also tiring because we were traveling a lot, but planning to just come back on Sunday, have a little regroup. And instead I got stuck. Delta was a hot mess.
Yeah, I was going to say, it really depends on the airline, because I actually flew the day of the CrowdStrike at whatever outage. I actually flew home from D.C. on American, different airline, and had no problems the exact same day. I actually, when we landed in O'Hare, like a lot of the screens were, like, for example, the screens for your baggage claim were all like blue screens in the airport. Like you couldn't look at the screen and determine anything. Yeah, they look like your home laptop that wasn't working or whatever, but I arrived on time. My baggage arrived on time. I had no problems. But Delta, from what I've heard, like people, it's just insane. Like people are going berserk online about the situation they're in because of that airline.
Yeah, they were really bad. I will say, I mean, they were really bad in terms of the cancellations. I think they canceled like over 50%. It might have been like more like 70% of their flights. I was very lucky to come back by Monday night. I was supposed to get back on Sunday night. But I also, I think, was pretty savvy. Because, I was like on all fronts. Like I was on the messaging app, I was like on the phone, and, finally got someone. And I do think they were very helpful once I was able to get someone. I have my medallion status, so maybe I was getting some VIP,
special treatment. Okay.
But I was happy. I was going to take it. And they have since given free miles and offered to reimburse, not just for me, but for everybody. I'm sure good up to anybody. But yeah. And then I was really lucky to be able to get on a flight that actually flew and also find a hotel room because Atlanta was a hot mess on Sunday night.
Wow. That sounds like stressful. It's funny because you had a wonderful trip. I saw the photos on Instagram, but that kind of takes some of the joy out of it when you have to deal with that on the way back.
I think it's like, I don't know how you deal with travel complications. I try to go to a Zen place and just kind of accept, the situation, like rather than try to resist it. And then it's hard, but I think it is what it is. I'm grateful to be home. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to travel. So whatever.
For sure.
MSW Media.